All right, so we have our final Skype session, so getting into the endocrine system and reproductive systems. Now, this unit is actually mostly finished, but many of you still have your test upcoming. Some of you have already done that test, and so far you've all done pretty well on it, but so we'll go through some of the concepts here for our hormones and reproduction. And let me just make sure that the recording, yeah, it's still good, okay. And so just to mention, part of Unit 6 was a discussion on reproductive technologies, which most of you have completed. Part of the assignment, as is with all the discussions, is responding to a post made by your peers. So quite a few of you missed that part of it and didn't respond. So if you'd like to go back and complete that part, I will adjust assignment grades. It is worth, a little over 20% for that part of it. So if anyone has not completed a response to one of your peers on reproductive technology, or even the discussion before it, go ahead and do that. Send me an email to say that it's done, and I will update your grades accordingly. Sometimes it can feel like, yes, finally I'm done that assignment, and then you forget that little piece on the end of it. So we'll open that up. Okay, so hormones. So this one can be a bit tricky. I find for this course it doesn't get super in-depth, thankfully, but there's enough to it that it can feel a little bit overwhelming at times. So I'll get started and we'll go over some of the main points. We'll do some practice questions, and then we'll move on to the reproductive system. So for starters, so kind of the main overviewing point, I guess, for hormones is the fact that we have these glands in our body that make up our endocrine system, and within those glands we have these endocrine cells. So the purpose of these cells is actually to, when they're stimulated or given the right stimulus, they give off hormone molecules, and then for most of them they are circulated through our bloodstream. So they enter into our blood vessels and are circulated via our circulatory system, and then they leave our blood vessels and they will bind to these specific receptors on target cells. So an example of that would be, if our pancreas is giving off insulin, so say our blood sugar is getting a bit too high, our pancreas gives off insulin. Insulin is circulated in our bloodstream, and then it's that hormone will bind to receptors on target cells. So one way that it brings down our blood sugar, if you remember correctly, is it encourages our body cells to actually take up more glucose. So our body cells would have receptors on them for insulin, and it's going to take up more blood glucose to get it out of the bloodstream. So that's one way it lowers our blood sugar. So I put up here in the corner kind of the statement: hormones are usually transported through blood vessels and affect only cells with specific receptors, so ones that it's designed to target. So there's two kind of main types of hormones, so water soluble and lipid soluble. So if you recently took the first part of this biology course, you'll know that a cell membrane is made up of lipids. So I think that's kind of how I keep it straight in my own mind, is that a hormone that's lipid soluble. So lipid soluble means it can pass through lipids. So those lipid soluble hormones are actually going to be able to enter the cell in order to trigger a response. Now compared to that, in comparison, so there's water soluble hormones. So water and lipids do not like to interact together, so the water soluble ones are not going to be able to pass through that cell membrane, and so it's going to trigger a response without ever going inside of the cell. So both of them will have receptors that it binds to. It's just that water-soluble ones are going to stay outside. Hi, Ruma. And lipid-soluble hormones are going to be able to enter the cell. So your textbook gives these two diagrams. So this is showing the water-soluble hormone, and it's connecting to a receptor on the outside of the cell, again, because water-soluble can't pass through that lipid layer. And then there's this transduction pathway, it's called, that happens within the cell that actually will cause the reaction it's meant to. And then in comparison, the lipid-soluble one can pass right through that plasma membrane and the receptors on the inside of the cell to cause the desired effect. So getting into the human endocrine system, this diagram shows kind of the main glands that we're going to talk about. So starting up at the top, the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which are fairly connected there up in the brain and the head. We have the thyroid in the neck, and parathyroid glands are just tiny glands that are actually embedded into the thyroid. We have the adrenal glands, which are pretty much like little hats on your kidneys, so the kidney hats. And then also in the abdomen is the pancreas. And then we have the gonads, so the testes in a male and the ovaries in a female. So those are the major players in our endocrine system. So this is a good slide that kind of sums up what each of those glands are responsible for. So the thyroid is going to give off hormones that primarily are going to be regulating your metabolism, so how quickly you're burning calories in the food that you eat. And the parathyroid, those tiny glands that are actually on your thyroid, those have to do more with your calcium levels in your body. So gonads, testes, and ovaries, those are going to produce the sex hormones, which we'll talk a bit more about. And then the hypothalamus pituitary. So the hypothalamus is kind of considered the CEO of everything. That's where your nervous system is actually communicating with your endocrine system, is primarily works through your hypothalamus. And then the pituitary, which is connected there. So the hypothalamus will make some of its own hormones. Some of them are stored in the posterior part of the pituitary. I have that on another slide. And then the anterior pituitary will make a lot of its own as well. And adrenal glands, number 4, so those are the kidney hats. So adrenal glands all have to do with that stress response, so both short and long term. And then pancreas is your glucose levels in your blood. So it's just kind of a nice summary. Oh, we have lots of people that joined there. Welcome, all of you. Feel free to use your mic if you want to stop me about anything, or just text over in the side there. So this slide is about your hypothalamus and your pituitary. So I've added a couple of extra things in there along with your book. So hypothalamus is kind of in the center part of your head, behind your eyes, and the pituitary is connected beneath that. So hypothalamus is your CEO. And then on this slide I have underlined about your posterior pituitary, kind of acting like a storage area for hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. And ADH and oxytocin are kind of the main ones that are stored there. So ADH, you may remember from our urinary system, that was the anti-diuretic hormone. So that will make your urine more concentrated because it's telling your body to hold on to more of its water to prevent dehydration. And oxytocin, so that's important kind of hormone in feelings of love and also in labor contractions. And I'll mention that one again in a bit too. And then the anterior pituitary will make its own hormones and release them. So the one example in your book is that human growth hormone, which is regulating how much our bodies grow. And it's also releasing a lot of other hormones that are stimulating other glands. So an example, it would release a hormone that's actually telling the thyroid to release or not release its own. So a lot of those releasing hormones. And that's just a picture of where you're going to find the hypothalamus and the pituitary in your head. This slide was added in here by a different instructor, so it's not, entirely addressed in your textbook, so I'm not sure why this one was really added in here, but it is kind of interesting. And if you watch the Skype session from the last time, I did give a little bonus project if you wanted an extra point, and it talked about, using things like meditation or yoga to decrease stress levels. And endorphins is something that's produced by your anterior pituitary. So that can actually reduce pain, and quite a few of you talked about kind of chronic pain that you experience in part of the nervous system reflection. So endorphins is something that can reduce that perception of pain. And meditation is something that's an exercise as well, are both believed to increase those endorphin levels. So on a personal note, it might be a useful connection for you. So one quiz question, which gland requires iodine to properly produce its hormones? So iodine is actually something that here in Canada is added to salt, like our table salt that you buy in a box. They actually add iodine into it, and it's specifically for this reason. A lot of parts of the world, diets can be deficient in iodine, and then they also end up having problems with this endocrine gland. So one person, said D and thyroid, and that is correct. So in order to make thyroid hormones, you do need iodine. And again, in Canada, it's not that difficult. If you are eating, added salt to things, you are probably getting enough iodine. So as far as the thyroid hormone goes, it's part of that negative feedback loop like many hormones are. And it's showing how your anterior pituitary is making one of these stimulating hormones that I mentioned. So it's going to tell the thyroid to produce thyroid hormones. And then as thyroid hormone increases, that negative feedback happens, which actually tells the anterior pituitary to stop creating so much thyroid stimulating hormone. So it is good on page 540 to 541. It does talk about hypothyroidism. So there's actually, and if you've already done the test, or if you have not done the test, I'll warn you that there's one question on there that I noticed recently that I don't really like. So I'm probably going to give you guys a point for that one, whether you answered it right or not. But it does have to do with hypothyroidism. So I would review the typical symptoms that happen with each. So for example, hypothyroidism, which means not enough thyroid hormone. You can have weight gain, being very tired. Your heart rate could slow down, and you can you can feel cold really easily. And then too much hormone or thyroid hormone is actually hyperthyroidism. And so it's kind of the opposite effect. You might sweat and feel hot all the time. It's really increasing your metabolism. Your heart rate could be too high. So the question on the test actually has to do with a goiter. So a goiter is actually a swelling of your thyroid in response to it not working correctly. And on the test, it's saying basically that it's a symptom of hypothyroidism, so not enough. But in actuality, it can be a symptom of either one. So the person that made that test question was just a little bit wrong. So I probably will add a point to everyone's quiz anyway. Okay, let me move my... Okay, so which gland makes two hormones that work in partnership to control blood glucose levels? So next up in our glands. C seems to be the general consensus, and that is correct. So pancreas is responsible for insulin and also glucagon. So those are antagonistic, which means they're kind of opposite. They work opposite of one another, and it's given off by your pancreas, so that's correct. So this can look very confusing, but in general, what it's saying is, you know, our bodies want to have homeostasis, and it wants to have homeostasis in regards to how much glucose is in our bloodstream. So if our glucose level is getting too high, so you say you're eating a really sugary meal. Let me grab a pen here. So right here, it's showing an arrow going, our glucose levels going up. So say you eat a lot of popsicles all at once. Your blood sugar will start to rise, and in response to that, your pancreas is going to start giving off insulin. So insulin works in two different ways. So it can tell our body cells to take up glucose. So if our cells are taking up that sugar, then it's actually coming out of our bloodstream. And it also tells our liver to store glucose, so it stores it as something called glycogen. And so by insulin working in these two ways, it's going to bring our blood sugar back down, and we're going to achieve homeostasis again. So the opposite thing that happens is down here on the bottom of the diagram. So say you have skipped a couple of meals today, so you actually have a decreased glucose level in your bloodstream. So that our pancreas responds to that by releasing something called glucagon, which is the opposite of insulin. And glucagon works by, so that glucose that was stored in our liver up here is now going to be, glucagon's going to tell our liver to break down that glycogen and release it back into our bloodstream as glucose. So by doing that, our blood sugar levels rise and we achieve homeostasis again. So this is just showing the two different ways, like if our blood sugar is too high or too low, how insulin and glucagon works to bring us back to an acceptable level. So diabetes is your main disorder that's associated with your pancreas. So there's type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. So type 1 really means that, and I believe it's more of an autoimmune thing. So for some reason your pancreas stops working correctly. And if it's not giving off insulin, then your blood sugar can rise very easily. If there's no way for your body to bring it back to a normal level on its own. So that's why people need to receive injections of insulin in order to allow your body cells to bring up or to take up sugar and for your liver to store it away. So the opposite of that is type 2 diabetes, and that's kind of a newer problem, and it's on the rise for sure. And it's associated more with not being active enough and obesity. So your pancreas can be giving off all the insulin it wants in type 2 diabetes. However, your body's cells are no longer responding to it appropriately. So it's not taking up the sugar how they're supposed to. So because of that, your blood sugar will rise. So even though your pancreas is working correctly, usually with type 2 diabetes, your body's not responding to that hormone how it's supposed to. So this is just a list of some symptoms that can happen when you have diabetes. So things like being very thirsty, having to urinate often, big changes in your weight, being very tired, blurred vision, As it gets worse, things like it can affect your circulation, so you may have more infections. Wounds would be slow to heal. It can also affect your nervous system, so having like tingling or numbness, especially in your hands or feet. And there's also sexual dysfunction that can happen, and that's due primarily to circulation issues. So next up, which gland makes two hormones that work in partnership to enable the body to respond to stress? So which gland has to do with responding to stress? So that's right, it's the adrenal glands. Those are those kidney hats. And there's two ways basically that your adrenal glands are going to respond to stress. So there's the short-term stress. So you're walking in the woods and someone dressed as a clown jumps out in front of you. That is definitely kind of a short-term, very quick stress that happens. And your your adrenal glands are going to give off epinephrine or norepinephrine and norepinephrine because of it. So these are the fight or flight hormones. And it's activated very, very quickly, and it generally lasts kind of a shorter period of time. So that's the short-term stress over here. So your blood pressure increases. Your body will actually increase your blood sugar level so that you have more sugar available to work your muscles if you have to run or fight. You're going to breathe heavier, your heart rate increases. And so that's that short-term response. And then the outer part of your adrenal gland actually will give off something called a corticosteroid or cortisol, which has to do with more long-term stress. So, for example, like doing a fast-track biology course in 7 weeks or 8 weeks, that could be considered more of like a long-term kind of stress. And, this is how your body can actually, if you've ever heard someone say, being stressed made them sick, well, that actually can happen because one of the side effects of these corticosteroids is that it will suppress your immune system a bit. Because if you're under stress, your body's primary goal is to get rid of that stress. So your immune system kind of takes a back seat in that it's going to focus more on the stress than the proper maintenance of your immune system. So long-term stress can actually make you sick. So which hormones are produced by the gonads? So gonads are the testes and ovaries. So both of them will produce the same types of hormones. It just depends on, it'll be different amounts depending on if male or female. And you all said D, all that is correct. So gonads are going to make estrogens, progestins, and androgens. An example of that one is testosterone. So estrogens and progestins are actually going to be in higher concentrations in women, but women will also have testosterone as well. It's an important part of our hormones, but higher concentration definitely of estrogens. So that's going to help develop, the secondary sex characteristics like breasts, widening of the hips. And it also helps to maintain our reproductive system. So it has an important role in menstrual cycle. Progestins, so an example is progesterone. So that's kind of involved more in, if you are to become pregnant, it helps support that pregnancy in the early stages especially. And then androgens, so they're actually in higher concentrations in men, but it's still important for men to have levels of estrogen and progestin as well. And so androgens are going to stimulate, the development of the male reproductive system. And also during the 7th week of gestation, so 7 weeks into pregnancy, the presence of an embryo giving off those androgens are going to actually stimulate a male fetus to develop rather than a female. So this looks very confusing. I get that. So I'll try to point out some of the main pieces of it. So this is actually female reproductive cycle. Let me grab a pen here. So again, it's talking about like the hypothalamus giving off some of these releasing hormones. So it's actually telling the anterior pituitary to give off FSH and LH. So kind of to point out, like FSH being follicle stimulating hormone, and a follicle is really this supporting structure that is developed around an egg inside the ovary. So this follicle stimulating hormone is very important to kind of allow an egg to mature enough to be released for fertilization. So this B here is actually showing these two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, which has a different kind of function, but it shows how they're both peaking directly before ovulation. So this dotted line is showing that ovulation is happening here around the middle of a cycle. And also around the middle of the cycle, it's showing how estrogen right here and progesterone are important. So estrogen peaks right before ovulation, but then progesterone happens, its peak is afterwards, because like I said, it has to do with supporting a pregnancy were it to happen. And then E down here actually shows, this is the lining of the uterus. So during menstruation, that lining is decreased. And as the cycle continues, it thickens again so that it's a nice, comfy, cozy home in case an egg is fertilized and implants. So we'll go over more about the reproductive system. I just wanted to really point out follicle stimulating hormone. So this table, I believe, is from your textbook, right? If not, it's from one version of these textbooks. So I included it here because it's kind of a, if you like the visual of a table, then it's a good one. So just knowing like what gland, like the thyroid gland, that it's primarily responsible for metabolism, parathyroid, calcium level, pancreas is going to be your insulin and glucagon, adrenal glands, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which do very similar things, and then your glucocorticoids or your cortisol, your long-term stress response, right? Then your gonads with androgens, estrogen, progesterones. Yeah, so some people, if you like a chart, then you'll probably like that one. It's a good visual. Okay, I have a few practice questions here. Let me see. You can click right on the screen. So which of the following statements is true? Water-soluble hormones trigger changes without entering the target cell. Lipid-soluble hormones cannot cross the lipid bilayer, or lipid-soluble hormones do not bind to receptor proteins. So multiple choice can be kind of tricky like this. You really have to, figure out, okay, so this question is saying which of the following is true? So that means at least two of them are going to be false. So sometimes you have to go one at a time and think, okay, so water-soluble hormones trigger changes without entering the target cell. So is this true or false, you think, in your head? And the correct answer is A. So water-soluble hormones, they make changes without entering the cell. So they're the ones that can't pass that lipid bilayer. They bind to the receptor on the outside. Right, let me find another question here. So the blank acts as a main control center of the endocrine system, sending messages to the pituitary gland. Yep, you can actually click right on the screen for these questions if you like. And you guys are correct, that's the hypothalamus. All right, question 3. Glucagon acts by raising blood sugar, lowering blood sugar, increasing urine output, or inducing fight or flight. So glucagon. So the correct answer is raising blood sugar. So insulin lowers your blood sugar. Glucagon will increase your blood sugar. So the correct answer is A, raising blood sugar. I think I have another one here. Yeah, if your blood sugar is getting too low, and an example would be as if you weren't eating enough, blood sugar is getting too low, then glucagon will kick into gear to increase your blood sugar by releasing the stored sugar in your liver. So the next question is, which of the following does not pair an endocrine gland with its function? So which one is not true, really? So adrenal gland and epinephrine. So you think in your head, is that true? Does adrenal gland create epinephrine? The next one is pancreas. Does the pancreas create things that influence your blood glucose level? The ovary. Is the ovary responsible for female sex characteristics? And then the pituitary gland. Is it responsible for the release of cortisol or corticosteroids? So which one it would not be correct? So a couple of you are correct. The one that does not pair an endocrine gland with its function is D, the pituitary gland. It does not release cortisol. That's the job of your adrenal gland. That's the corticosteroid for long-term stress. So that's part of the adrenal gland, not the pituitary. So the correct answer there is D. I think I have one more endocrine question here. So the thyroid is most closely associated with what role? Secondary sex characteristics, metabolism, blood sugar, or stress response? And you guys are correct. It's metabolism. So thyroid is most closely associated with your metabolism. All right, so let's go back to PowerPoint. So chapter 26 is reproduction. So the chapter starts off saying, animals reproduce in a great variety of ways, but there are two principal modes, so asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Now it's funny how this is worded in your textbook, because for a living creature I can't think of other ways that reproduction happens other than asexual or sexual, but your textbook says there's a great variety, so these are just the two principal modes. So asexual reproduction, so that's reproduction without sex. and it creates, the offspring that happen from this type of reproduction are genetically exactly the same as the parent. So on page 552 is where it talks about this. So there are some advantages to this. So even if an organism is completely alone or by itself, it can still reproduce, which is impossible with sexual reproduction, or often impossible with sexual reproduction. There's one thing that doesn't quite work with that, but it's also, multiplying can happen very, very quickly. So there's not a lot of energy or time devoted to having to create sperm and eggs. So it can happen very quickly. The disadvantage is that genetically they're all the same. So if one organism, suffers from certain, genetic disability, for example, then all the offspring will have the same genes happening. And also if a disease or some kind of toxin comes into the environment, they will all respond to it the same. So it can wipe out whole colonies of living creatures. So which of the following are examples of asexual reproduction? So two examples it gives in your book of asexual reproduction is budding and fission. So which of the following examples would be showing that asexual reproduction? A and B, C and D, or all types? I don't know why it says all three types, because there's 4. Yeah, it's A and B really. It's showing budding and fission happening. C and D is actually showing spores being released, so that would actually be a type of sexual reproduction. So you're right, A and B. So there's a small piece in your textbook that talks about some species that can be hermaphroditic. So I guess you can answer this question. Hermaphrodites are animals that develop from unfertilized eggs, usually fertilize themselves, possess both male and female reproductive systems, or have abnormal reproductive systems. So you're correct, it's C. So an organism that would be a hermaphrodite would have both male and female reproductive systems. So sometimes they can fertilize their own eggs, but many of them actually still require a partner, so would still be reproducing sexually. But for example, that earthworm, if two come together, they can actually swap sperm and fertilize their own eggs. So often they still will require a partner to reproduce. And this was just added in here. So, we don't call people hermaphrodites. That's like a very outdated kind of term to use, but there is intersex conditions and where people can have structures that are typically male and typically female. And this is kind of a cool book. It's Canadian, and it's about someone with an intersex condition. So if it's something that interests you, it is kind of a cool book to look at. So fertilization. So this is one of the main points in sexual reproduction, and it gives an example. One thing could be external fertilization, so it's also called spawning. So this picture shows 2 frogs. So one frog will actually be male and one is female. So the female is actually releasing the eggs, and at the same time the male is releasing sperm, but it's all external, so it's all in the water surrounding the 2 frogs. So usually this type of fertilization has to happen in an aquatic environment. If these two frogs were on land, then the sperm would have almost zero chance to be able to get to the eggs. So usually, you know, animals that live on land are going to need internal fertilization. Here's a couple of interesting facts about male reproduction that you would probably have found in your textbook if you remember. So why are testes, so male gonads, why are they outside the body? Yeah, so most of you are saying B, so that's right. Temperature in the abdomen is too warm. That's right. If the male gonads is actually in the scrotum outside of the body, it's actually at least a couple of degrees cooler, and that is ideal for sperm production. And question 8, what percentage of semen is sperm? Is 5%. That's right. You guys have good memory. So one term in your text would be gestation. So gestation is another name for what? Conception, pregnancy, ovulation, or fertilization. Rowan says B. Alusola says pregnancy. That's right. And so you're correct, it is B. So gestation is just another word for pregnancy. Gestation is that time from fertilization until birth. So oogenesis and spermatogenesis can be a bit confusing because it's starting to get into, you know, some genetic terms like meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. But here's kind of just a summary of that. So oogenesis, so actually women, when we are born, we already have, you know, the cells are already there that are going to become mature eggs later on in life. So we're born with all of our egg cells that we're ever going to have already waiting inside ovaries. In comparison to that, men, spermatogenesis, so that's the creation of the sperm cells, that actually starts around puberty, and it will continue throughout their whole life, you know, as long as nothing interferes with that. So oogenesis, we start with one cell, and through the process of meiosis, we actually, in the end, get one mature egg. So one mature egg that has half the genetic material required. And it actually isn't complete until it's fertilized. So down here at the bottom, where it says completion after fertilization of sperm, so oogenesis isn't complete until that haploid egg is fertilized. In comparison, spermatogenesis, so we have the one, it starts with one sperm cell, and through the process of meiosis and division, it will actually create 4 mature sperm cells, and it's complete before ejaculation, so before they leave the testes, it's complete. So that's your basic synopsis of gametogenesis. So anatomy, so gamete, so one of the main things here, so you don't need to memorize all of these different parts of anatomy, but something to keep in mind that gamete production, so that's the production of sperm cells, happens in the testes, and for women it happens in the ovaries. So when fertilization happens, I'm just trying to see which page number this is in case you're following with the book. Oh, okay, it's on 562 if you're following along. So this is just showing, you know, how fertilization by sperm happens. So this down here would be a piece of the egg. And there are these cells that kind of coat it. They're the leftovers from that follicle that I mentioned before. So the sperm makes its way to the coating of the egg, and it gives off these enzymes that help kind of break down the coating around the egg. So then when the plasma membranes of the sperm cell and the egg cell, they fuse together, the nucleus, which contains the genetic material, enters into the egg cell, combining with the nucleus of the egg to create something that has the full set of genes. So we need a full complement, so half are coming from sperm and half are coming from the egg. So where does fertilization usually occur? So where is that happening, the sperm meeting the egg? Is it in the vagina, the uterus, the oviduct, which is also known as the fallopian tube? You are correct. It's C, the oviduct. So the sperm has to travel, a fair distance to get there. Through regular sexual reproduction, it's deposited into the vagina. It has to travel through the uterus, which is here, and into the fallopian tube. And in this example, it's actually being fertilized here. So the egg was released from the follicle in the ovary into the oviduct, and that's where it was fertilized. So once it's fertilized, it's then now called a zygote. Once that starts to divide, so it's called cleavage. So once there's that first division into more than one cell, it's then called an embryo. The embryo will then become a blastocyst. These are just the different names that the process goes through. And the blastocyst, around, between days 7 to 10, implants into the lining of the uterus, which is called the endometrium. So it's about 6 to 7 days after fertilization. It's called the blastocyst, which is basically like just a hollow ball of cells. That's where we were back here. And this is what it would look like on the inside if you were to open up that blastocyst. And then next, after about 9 days, it's actually called a gastrula. So what this means is this ball of cells has actually differentiated into 3 different layers. So the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. And so this is the very beginning of those cells developing into all the different tissues and organs that make up a human. So the ectoderm is pretty much going to become the nervous system and the skin. The mesoderm, which is the center layer here, is going to become the heart and muscles and other similar organs. And then the endoderm is, destined to become your digestive system, liver, pancreas, thyroid. Those are the examples. So these 3 layers become all of those different things. So this is just kind of giving a timeline. So this is showing like just before implantation, so around day 6, it's that blastocyst. And so it has the red border, which is associated with this red square. So 0 would be the day of conception, so the day the egg was fertilized. This red border is showing about 6 days after, so right after or before implantation. The yellow border here is associated right here. It's about 10 days or so, 7 to 10 days. So that's when it's actually implanting. And then this green border is associated with this green one. So this is about a month or 31 days where the embryo is already kind of formed. There's blood flow going to the beginning parts of a placenta into a beginning circulatory system. And again, this is showing So this red here, so this 0 again is like when conception would happen. This is about 5 weeks, what a fetus would look like, about 9 weeks and 14 weeks. Then it kind of ends with, you know, the basics of stages of labor. So I would take a little peek at, so that pregnancy is divided into the first trimester, second trimester, and third. So I would take a peek there about what sort of things generally are happening in each of those trimester. You know, for, you know, kind of like an average size, what they may or may not be able to do during those 3 trimesters. Nothing too in depth, but just have a look at them. It's on page 566 and 567. And then it ends in birth. So the 3 main stages are, so the cervix is here and is normally closed, and it kind of acts as almost like a gateway between the vagina and the uterus. And so the first part of labor is that cervix actually has to dilate or open up to allow passage of the baby. And then expulsion means actually delivering of the infant. And then the third stage being the placenta, which was that kind of life support system, that connection between the circulatory systems. So delivery of the placenta. And an interesting fact, so I talked about oxytocin being, you know, created by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and it's responsible for contractions during labor. So this is one of those rare examples of something that works by positive feedback. So most of these hormones and things we talked about are negative feedback, meaning, you know, if something increases, it can actually turn off whatever started it. So oxytocin is actually positive feedback, meaning that contractions will continue to intensify, which will give off more oxytocin. So it will just continually increase until birth is complete. So if oxytocin actually worked by negative feedback, then that means the more oxytocin and contractions that were given off, the less, so actually labor would stop if it was negative feedback. So it's an example of positive feedback. Are there any questions? Are you guys excited to almost be done your fast track biology? I've had a really enjoyable time being the facilitator for this course. You guys have really, passed in some amazing work. I've been very impressed with the quality of things you guys pass in. So I've been really lucky. You have your test today in the evening. Well, good luck. Some of you have already done your test, so this Skype is coming a bit late in that, but so far you've all done pretty well on this test anyway, so hopefully the rest of you don't find it too hard. I was going to point out, and let me just bring up my desktop here, and again I will mention that if you didn't reply, oh, you're welcome. I've had fun doing it, so I look forward to your final projects you pass in too. So I did mention at the very beginning, if you missed it, that if you haven't responded to one of your peers' discussion posts on reproductive technology, make sure you go and do that and send me an email saying that you've done it, so that you get the points for that, because it's over 20% is your response to someone else, and quite a few of you forgot to do that. So make sure you go do that and let me know if you completed it. I'm just going to show you my desktop here because I wanted to bring up one of your final essays. Okay, so the evolution connection assignment. So what I wanted to bring up about this, and actually I'm just going to